dismal situation. If you look at Afro-America, what was the situation in Afro-America around the end of the 19th century, around the beginning of the 20th century? As you know, we had obtained the right to vote, the right to send representatives to Congress after the so-called Civil War, the war that I prefer to call the War of the Slaveholders' Rebellion, because that's what it was, the War of the Slaveholders' Rebellion. After that war, for the first time in the history of this country, African-American people gained basic civil rights. Now, you might have heard of the famous, or I should say the infamous, notorious Dred Scott decision of 1857, when the Supreme Court of this country laid down as law, and you know that anything the Supreme Court says is law. Whatever judgment the Supreme Court lays down has the same weight as though it's a law passed in Congress. Every decision of the Supreme Court is the law of the land. The Supreme Court of this country laid down in the Dred Scott case, 1857, as the law of the land, that quote, and here I quote the famous quotation that I know many of you are familiar with, that white people, that black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect. In other words, the Supreme Court said that black people were not citizens of these United States. This is 1857. This is 4 years before the so-called Civil War began. The law of the land was, coming into the Civil War, that black people were not citizens of this country. Black people had no rights that white people were bound to respect. If any individual white person, out of the goodness of their hearts, felt like being good to black people, that was their business, that was their private business. There was no law, there was no constitutional provision making it mandatory for white people to respect the normal constitutional guarantees that Americans usually have come to expect. That was the situation coming into the Civil War. It was after the Civil War ended in the 1860s that black people became citizens for the first time, were given the right to vote, given the right to elect representatives to Congress. Within a very short space of that apparent advance, all of those gains were totally wiped out. By the time that Garvey was born in 1887, most of those gains were already well on the way to being lost. By the time the 20th century began, all of those congressmen, all of those senators and what have you, who had been elected by black Americans, had been driven from Congress. That's one of the reasons why they call the civil rights struggle of the 60s sometimes the second Reconstruction, because it was very much like this first Reconstruction after the Civil War. One of the lessons of that first Reconstruction is that political, constitutional advance by itself doesn't guarantee anything. It's a help maybe, but it doesn't guarantee anything. As a matter of fact, we had more congressmen sitting in Congress in Washington, D.C. in the 1860s and 70s than we had in the 1950s and 60s when the civil rights struggle was going on. A lot more. But yet, in 2 or 3 decades, all of that was lost. All of those congressmen were chased out of Congress. Black people could not vote anymore. They were being killed for trying to vote and so on. So that was a situation that Garvey came into as far as Afro-America was concerned. I heard the minister this morning talk about lynching. Garvey came into a situation where black people in this country were lynched on a daily basis. Lynching was a national pastime in this country in the years, towards the end of the 19th century. Every single day, practically, somewhere in this country, especially in the South, you could pick up the newspaper and read a story of a black man, woman, or child being strung up from a lamppost, killed, burnt at the stake. They talk about witches being burnt at the stake in the old days, but they used to burn black folk at the stake here, in the lifetime of many people who are still alive. Very often, I tell my students that next time you're on a train or plane or something, traveling next to an old white man or a fat lady, you better ask them if they ever lynched anybody, because many of them are, many of those lynchers are still alive, walking the streets. And Lord knows what kind of vibrations they must be sending to the children and the grandchildren. Black people were burned. Sometimes the body was burned, then riddled with bullets, then hung. There were cases where the body was tied to the end of an automobile and driven through the streets. The head was chopped off sometimes and displayed. White people would fight over the bodies, literally fight for souvenirs, cutting off fingers, toes, ears, genital organs. W.E.B. Du Bois tells us right here in Atlanta, when W.E.B. Du Bois was teaching here at Atlanta University, I think it was somewhere around 1906, there was a race riot here in Atlanta. Not really a race riot, but a massacre of black people, really. And Du Bois tells us that the morning after the so-called riot, He wrote an article condemning, the actions of these white lynchers and so on. And Du Bois tells us that he was walking down the street with his article in his briefcase or whatever, taking it down to some place, newspaper office or some place to be published. And Du Bois says that on the way down the street, with the article in his pocket, he passed by a shop window. That's right here in Atlanta. He passed by a shop window. And in the window, on public display, there were the remains, some of the remains of the victim, or one of the victims of that lynching the day before, in a pickle jar. These are parts of the body of a black person who were displayed in public in a store window in a pickle jar. So this is the kind of situation then that Garvey found our race facing, an awful situation. As we know, thousands and thousands of African American people from the South in this period were moving north, trying to escape the kind of horror that was existing here in those days. Our so-called ghettos in Harlem and Detroit and Philadelphia and all over the place were taking shape. So Garvey then appeared at a time when in Afro-America things were really at a very low ebb. In Africa itself, the situation wasn't any better. Africa had been the cradle of civilization. While the Europeans, as Garvey used to say, were living in caves and holes and dens, to quote one of Garvey's poems, our people had pioneered writing. We were the first people to invent writing. We were building structures, the pyramids, which are larger than any of the modern skyscrapers. The pyramids are larger than any of the modern skyscrapers. And we were building those structures at a time when the Northern Europeans were still painting themselves blue. Literally, the English used to paint themselves blue. When the Romans, when Julius Caesar conquered England in 50-something BC, the English folks were running around in skins and painting themselves blue. The English were enslaved. They were enslaved and they were brought to Rome. And when one of the Roman senators saw the English in the slave market, he said that these are the stupidest slaves I've ever seen, the English. And thousands of years before that, we were writing, we were building. The very first monarchy, the very first civilization in the history of the world, as you know, comes out of Nubia, not even Egypt, but Nubia, to the south of Egypt. And they talk about, being not sure what color the Egyptians were. They were Africans, they were black people. They may have been mixed with somebody else, but they were still black. But when it comes to the Nubians, there's no doubt at all, because the Nubians were jet black. Jet black. And they were before the Egyptians. In fact, the latest research tells us now that the Egyptians got their religion from the Nubians, Even the hieroglyphics, the Egyptian writing, the pyramids, the crowns that the Egyptian pharaohs used to wear, the worship of Horus, the Egyptian god, all that was in Nubia before the Egyptians got it. But yet and still, by Garvey's time, all of that had been wiped away. As a result of 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade, Africa had been reduced to devastation. Practically the whole of the African continent had been demolished by European imperialism in a very short space of time. And many of us forget how relatively recent the conquest of Africa was. We think of the slave trade. The slave trade started in 1441. It went on right up until the 19th century. But for most of the 400 years of the slave trade, Africa remained unconquered. It was only when the slave trade ended in the 19th century that Africa became so weakened that as a result of 400 years of that trade, that the conquest of Africa took place. So Garvey was actually born when the conquest of Africa was just really getting into full swing. So by the beginning of the 20th century, by the First World War, 1914, the last African countries were being conquered by European imperialism. So Garvey was facing a situation in Africa then where African countries had lost their independence, almost totally. Only Liberia and Ethiopia of the whole African continent had any semblance of independence left. And let us not forget that in Africa we're talking here about the world's second largest continent. And you mightn't believe that if you look at the map of the world that most of us grew up with. One of the things I'll talk about later today is the question of propaganda and the fact that we, as African people, have to interpret our own reality, something that Garvey always said. The white man has reinterpreted the world according to his own image and likeness. One of the most incredible areas in which the white man has reinterpreted the world is in that map of the world which all of us grew up with. That map of the world is one of the greatest hoaxes ever perpetrated upon an unsuspecting